That's another one just coming in. Oh, and another one. There we go. So Felcha, Fescoma, to our slightly late arrivals. We're just getting going now, and I'll pass over to Anna to begin the presentation. Thank you, Anna.
Hi folks, yeah, I'm just going to start my presentation in a second. So as Nicola said, if you've got questions or anything throughout the talk or any thoughts or ideas, please add them to the chat. We've got loads of time built in at the end to kind of discuss or answer any outstanding questions. And I can see from a few of the names of people here that if they are the same people as I think they are behind the names, we've got quite a few people here with really good Gaelic knowledge. So maybe we can have some really nice kind of discussion and conversation at the end. So just going to get started by sharing my screen. I'll go back to the beginning. So hi everybody. Yeah, I'm Anna MacQuarrie, Anna MacQuarrie in Gaelic. Although I spend quite a significant portion of my working life and my own personal life kind of discussing and reflecting on the themes of this topic, this is actually the first proper workshop in this sort of way that I've delivered. So thank you to Museums and Heritage Highland for inviting me, and I hope I've got the balance right between an introduction as well as some kind of tangible examples and helpful information too. It's very much focused towards people who are kind of beginning to explore Gaelic within heritage settings. But as I say, I think hopefully we've got some folk with us today who have got a good amount of knowledge too, who can maybe reflect on their own experiences of working with Gaelic in museums and heritage settings. So the talk today, I'm just going to start my timer. The talk today will be split into these 4 sections, with most time spent on this 3rd section, where I'm going to be looking at tangible, specific examples. So we'll come through these as we go. So just as an introduction, a wee bit about me, as Nicola said, I've been working in the museum sector for about 10 years now in roles which have taken me right across Scotland. I've worked kind of from like the Central Belt over west to the Hebrides and up into Orkney as well. It's mostly been in curatorial and community heritage focused roles. But as a native speaker of Gaelic, that's just kind of always presented itself as being a really important part of my work. So at the moment, I'm working with 4 museums in the Highlands as their Gaelic Museum Development Officer. And last year, I graduated from Solmarostic, part of the UHI, with an MSc in Material Culture and Gaelic History, so that's Gaelic history. And rather than the kind of formal graduation photos, I prefer this one that I had taken the next day in the rain, in Skye, at a road that was named after my late dad. So it means a lot more to me, that one. My dissertation for that was examining kind of typical and atypical sources of evidence for traditional ways of life in the Ross of Mull, and all of that being from a Gaelic perspective. So a lot of that was to do with around the landscape, the environment, and material culture, and it really helped kind of formalize and kind of help me like critically analyze a lot of the stuff that I've been thinking about through my work prior to that. I was lucky to be raised in a Gaelic-speaking household and with a great sense of pride in my language and in my culture. With this excerpt here from the creation of Solmarostic kind of saying something about why, about really what languages are, that it isn't just a means of communication, it is so much more than that. And it's these sort of principles which kind of underpin why I believe, and I should say that everything I'm conveying in this talk today is very much my own perspective on things, but why I think that it's so important that we do this work. And then from a policy document, a very succinct way of phrasing it, that here, Catúchín or dúchas as Ernest Yola said Gaelic. We can't understand our heritage without knowing something about Gaelic, which I think is, within a Highland setting, only too true. So I want to give a wee brief overview of the wider context and background that we're working in when we use Gaelic. Some of you will know a lot of this already, and I think we might have a few people with us who are actually very, very strong on the kind of the legal and the policy context. this isn't a talk about that at all, but it is really important to kind of situate where we are. So Gaelic is one of Scotland's national languages. It's indigenous to Scotland. It is a minority language, but it's minoritized as well. A really important kind of specific word there being used to say something about kind of external forces at play. And yeah, so minoritized used very purposely rather than this minority alone. And it is absolutely not the same as Gaelic, Irish Gaelic. It's a mistake which I heard just a couple of days ago being used by somebody talking about Scottish Gaelic, but saying Gaelic is a different language and is a good rule to kind of remember. So, and as mentioned, because this is a talk being delivered by MHH, everything I'm talking about is really thinking about it from a Highland perspective. Approaches and ideas might differ in an urban or suburban context, and possibly in an island context as well. But everything I'm talking about today is really relevant to the Highlands. So I'm going to talk about, and I should have said actually back when I was here, I said it's one of Scotland's national languages, and we'll return to a wee bit at the end, but it's legally protected to a degree, but it's not afforded the same rights as seen in other countries. Wales is often held up as being kind of a good standard to aim towards, with the Welsh language being much more present, much more evident, still flawed in many ways. But Gaelic isn't afforded those same rights at all. And we'll kind of come back to that a wee bit at the end when we're looking at kind of advocacy and maybe how we can kind of help advocate for the language. But first of all, Nicola had a really good idea of doing some do's and don'ts. And I could spend basically this whole session just rattling these off. But these points, although broad and relevant to many aspects of working with Gaelic, also have kind of specific relevance to our work within museums and heritage as well. I could also caveat every one of these for different circumstances, but that way madness lies, so I'm not going to do that. But to dig into these a wee bit, I would say do normalise use of Gaelic. If you have any Gaelic whatsoever, or if you're starting to pick up some Gaelic, use it. Use it every day, use it in every context that you can. Get used to saying it, hearing it, recognising it when it's all around. It's still not normalised in every setting that it could or should be. And within museums, we've got a role there to play that even if it's something as straightforward as saying, as Nicola did at the beginning, fáilte, welcome to people, it's putting it to use. It doesn't need to be complicated, doesn't need to be kind of overdone in any way, but it does help people remember that the language is there and present. Work collaboratively with other people. I think in museums we tend to be quite good at this as it is. The nature of working in a sector which is often under-resourced means that we have to collaborate with other people to get things done. And Gaelic is a really another good route to kind of stretch those collaboration muscles. An example here, and something which I'll come back to later on, is kind of a whole network of Gaelic development officers who work across the country. I'm one of them in my role. Lots of people who work in many different sectors, not just museum specific, but who have really good solid knowledge of working in and with Gaelic in community settings and corporate settings, people who you can connect to gain their expertise and gain access to a whole world of people that you might not otherwise know. And interestingly, there's going to be a public map coming out soon, I believe, by Borna Gaelic, the National Development Agency for Gaelic, showing where Gaelic development officers are situated around the country. I think working collaboratively can also help demonstrate the interest, the need for expertise and additional support and funding to the powers that be, whether that's the local authority, whether that's your museum board, whether that's Borna Gaelic themselves, who have got a huge amount of responsibility in this, but also our museum bodies like Museums Gallery Scotland, the National Museums, Historic Environment Scotland, these bodies who have got a lot of clout and sway in the way that we go about doing our work. If we collaborate and demonstrate the need that there is for more support and more resource, that can go a long way. So do consider the perspective of Gaelic speakers. This is true for people in the past when we're reflecting on past lives and stories, and also people now. We'll kind of come back to this a wee bit as we work through examples. Do consider conscious and unconscious bias as well. That's very important in anything when we're dealing with history. We know that, but it's especially true with Gaelic. I've got one specific example that I'll show you later on from a museum where it's it's horribly biased. And it's really another reason why we always have to be kind of thinking about what we're saying and being very conscious that we're not inadvertently playing down a minoritized culture. And do cherish it. It's a wonderful thing. It's a rich language and culture. It's a new way, a different way for many of you to be looking at the world and experiencing it. There's a lot there to love, but it needs to be cherished. It really does. And don't. So this list could even be could be so much longer. But primarily, don't leave misconceptions unchallenged. That's really one of the big things. Um, being part of any minority culture, there's always going to be people who are to less or greater degree against it. But often it's from a place of misunderstanding or just not knowing very much. If you are educating yourself and you're learning about Gaelic and you're hearing things being said which you know are just inaccurate and untrue, challenge it. Say to people, well, maybe there's a different way of looking at this. It's really, really important that we continue to do that. And I think it flies in with the kind of the idea of conscious and unconscious bias. People often don't even realize what they're saying, but it can be really, really damaging and profoundly hurtful if you're somebody of that culture too. Don't assume no one around you has it. Something that I hear quite a lot is that kind of classic thing of, oh, this language is dead. There's nobody here that speaks it. It was never spoken here. It's irrelevant. But it's actually more often than not, none of those statements are true. But if you're not a Gaelic speaker, if you haven't been today actively engaged in the culture, it might well be that you just don't realize that there's actually people who perhaps were raised with a great understanding of it or have a lot of knowledge about it through some other means, or perhaps have started to kind of learn the language themselves. They might be on day 400 and something of Duolingo or have started learning through some other means. So never make that assumption that it isn't around you just because you yourself don't know. Be open to well, the normalization of it really. Don't just translate. Now, this is something we'll come back to when we're looking at the specific examples. Resist the temptation of Google Translate for a start. I know that it's there and it's a very easy thing to do, but don't just translate English into Gaelic. We can think we should really be thinking about reinterpretation of what we're doing and developing text or any sort of material which builds in a Gaelic perspective. So considering the perspective of Gaelic speakers and of their experiences. Don't forget the strach. So this is that accent that you see over the A. That's a grave accent in English and Gaelic. It's called a strach. Leaving it off often is quite benign, but it can change the meaning of a word. If you see that used in Gaelic, please just copy and paste it. It only ever goes in that direction and it's only ever a vowel in Gaelic, but seeing it not used can mean there isn't a certain level of care in the language. I've got an example later on to show you about where it's really important that you do use it and where the meaning changes quite dramatically. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. This is maybe the most important golden rule of them all. It can be really intimidating, I think, probably, I assume, working in a language and culture that you don't know, but don't let making a mistake put you off trying to do something with Gaelic. I think the most important thing is that you're trying and that you're giving it a shot in the first place. So yeah, I wholeheartedly encourage anybody to use it. And indeed, today, if you've got things that you want to use, this isn't a supportive environment in which that you should do that. Please don't be afraid of making a mistake. So I've littered this presentation with kind of wee fun facts, just as like a palate cleanser as I sort out my notes as we go between sections. I'm not really going to delve into these very much, but they're just there for interest. So there are different approaches that you can take in museums. These are some of them. There are many more examples, but these are ones where of 3 of these sections I'm going to be showing specific examples. The first one here, Gaelic led, such as in Museum de Nelan in Stornoway and Benbecula, I'm actually not going to delve into too much because this is a presentation about and a workshop about really finding your beginning with Gaelic, this approach needs a fairly good degree of competency, both with the language and with an understanding of the culture. It's, for me, the best approach. It should be the gold standard for everything, but it's something which can't always be delivered with existing kind of resources and knowledge. So we can maybe talk about that in the chat later on, but what I'm going to focus on will be bilingual sections within a museum, such as Gaelic Museum, and I know we've got some past and present representation there, so comments welcome. Gaelic integrated into English text, as can be seen at Brain Legion and Skye, and Gaelic concepts explained in English, such as the Kyle Ray Otterhide. We'll be looking at specific examples of all of these. Now, to dive right in, and this is us already into section 3, as I mentioned, the bit that we're going to be spending the most time in. We've got here from Gaelic Museum. So interpretation can kind of exist as object labels interpretation. Well, Gaelic can exist in all these settings, but Gaelic can exist in every function of a museum. But what we've got here is that this is and I'm going to keep apologising for the quality of the photos that I'm using in this because they're all taken on my mobile, which is really old. But I'll zoom in on this in a second. But here, this is like, it's fairly straightforward as far as the display panel goes. I mean, it's beautifully done. But we've got red text and black text. It looks like a lot all at once, but the colours here are actually differentiating between Gaelic at the top and English at the bottom. I also like that we've got the alliteration in the Gaelic, which is missing in the English too. It's like a nice little Easter egg for Gaelic speakers like me who like a little bit of alliteration. And if I zoom in here on the main body of text, what we've got is interpretation, which is a biography of two individuals who are really significant in the local and the national context for Gaelic, for championing it, for preserving local dialects, and for the rights of Gaels and of Gaelic speakers. But the principle behind this is really straightforward and one that can be replicated anywhere, and that is that the text between the languages is differentiated visually. So to my eyes, I think the actual font is the same, but the colours here are different. And importantly, Gaelic comes first. Because we're working in the context of a minority language, we're kind of habituated for our eyes to always be drawn to English. So here it's giving Gaelic the kind of the step up by putting it first. English speakers, their eyes will find what they're looking for at the bottom, but it's ensuring that in this context, Gaelic is coming first, which is a small detail, but an important one, which can have quite a lot of significance. In this instance as well, we've got Gaelic as a topic in its own right because of the work that these two individuals did, and situating Gaelic within its local context, but also the wider significance of these people's work, which is entirely appropriate in this context. It's a useful reminder to think that Gaelic museums doesn't just have to be about Gaelic. Here, it's right that it is, but it can be about anything. So for more from Gaelic, and here, this is in a separate part of the museum, and I would say that we've got an approach here which maybe be more familiar to a lot of people, but where I think there's an opportunity to do more. So these objects will be familiar to anybody who's used to working with social history collections, absolutely gorgeous objects, especially, I mean, these in the middle, just absolutely beautiful. And in this, I don't know if anybody else is seeing it. I'm seeing little green ticks. They're not mine, so please overlook them if anybody else can see them on the screen. But here we've got your fairly standard object label, really nice and sharp, clear text. But if I just keep your attention over the right-hand side here, you can see in these red bits that I've circled, we've got the English language names and then the Gaelic text here. So Crechanen and then Fugin. What I would say here there's an opportunity to do, and this is, well, before we get into the opportunity that's here, we'll maybe see this quite often in a lot of museums that we go and visit, that you'll see the kind of Gaelic name used there. It won't necessarily be extrapolated in any way. There won't necessarily be any kind of explanation of it or kind of put in any context, but it is used. Its use is important and it's positive, just full stop. But here I would say that where the people using these objects might only have been Gaelic speakers, maybe we could look a little bit further at what these words actually mean, if there is more to it. Quite often names in Gaelic will have a lot more to say than just a descriptive name. And over on the left here, in a similar vein, we talk about the dairy equipment had to be packed and transported for the trip to the shieling. Now, shieling life within Gaelic culture for a long time would have been really, really a significant part of kind of the annual cycle of work and experiences. Particularly in the Highlands and parts of the islands, it wasn't universal, but it was very much present in a lot of the culture. So here's an opportunity where a lot of around shieling life is still kind of preserved in different ways in the language and in the culture. So here it might be an opportunity, rather than just making a statement about the shieling, that we could talk about actually what that meant to the people of the time and to Gaelic culture. So there's nothing wrong with the way that this has been done at all, but it's an opportunity of where Gaelic is there, but there could be a lot more of it as well. So now we've got an example of, just going to check where I am with my notes. So Uabasoch in Gaelic means terrible, but it also means terribly, as in Uabasoch ma, terribly good. So I wanted to give you two examples. I'm not going to name where this is from, but you might be familiar with the style and design of it. It's from a public body museum. It's not from an independent museum. And this is something which has been on display for years. And every time that I see it, it really rankles with me. It's that idea about unconscious bias, and that when the person who wrote this was really kind of showing what they thought of Gaelic and how they kind of viewed the language. So the fact is, I mean, that it's this first section is entirely inaccurate for a start. Every language has its own rules by which to learn. Gaelic isn't any harder to learn than any others. It's one of those misconceptions that we need to challenge whenever it presents itself to us. And I think it's kind of, it says something about this slightly monoglot attitude that we have in the UK as a whole, where we're so unused to having other languages in our lives that this idea that you know, any language is hard to pronounce or learn. Yes, and then there's this bit which is just really unhelpful. So this is what I was getting at when I was saying that idea of unconscious bias and, you know, challenging misconceptions. If you're writing about Gaelic in this way, if you're wanting to share anything about it, kind of review critically what it is that you're saying, what sort of underlying message is coming across. So moving from this example in one museum to another one, which I think was really good. I was really, really interested in this one. So just before lockdown, in 2020, I saw this exhibition at the Hunterian in Glasgow. So it was a temporary exhibition. I don't know if it's ever been anywhere else. But this was based around, as you can see here on the right-hand side, was called Guca Shlia Gaelic, so the route to Gaelic, exploring Gaelic identities. And it was using, I think, exclusively material from the Hunterian's own collections. So it was quite heavy on the archives. But what I thought was interesting here was that the main body of text in each of these panels was like the main messaging in it was more or less the same. But with the way that this had been designed, and in fairness, they're probably very expensive to produce, you know, fancy sort of design panels, each language is kind of given its own room to breathe. Gaelic is, and kind of Gaelic ideas were throughout the text of the English, but the Gaelic itself was just kind of given its own room, but given kind of parity with English, more or less. In some places, Gaelic was prominent. And I thought it was a really, really interesting approach and a way of with clever design that I hadn't really seen kind of undertaken in another museum setting. So if there are examples that any of you attending here who have seen elsewhere that you think are good or interesting, please share them, because I think it could be a really, really useful thing to kind of maybe discuss at the end. So it's something to think about. Between the example from Gaelic Museum with the different colour text, still accessible from an accessibility perspective, and with Gaelic at the top, to then having something like this, which is kind of design-led with like the bold shapes, but the same principle of colour differentiating them as well, and each language given its own room and space to breathe. There's these sorts of principles are actually very easy to apply to our own work when we're looking at displays and kind of applying that to what we're doing. So moving on, many of you will be familiar with the Gaelic tree alphabet. a lot of us Gaels feel that it's been kind of a bit done to death, but it is still interesting. Um, Now, what I want to get into is that we've looked so far at examples of Gaelic kind of in written displays, which is, you know, a really big part of any museum work. But it's really important that we also still hear the language as well. Using it in everyday speech through normalization, but this also adds to that idea of normalization as well, that you're hearing it within the museum, within the museum setting. There are a lot of different ways that you can do this depending on your own organizational setup. But if you're needing somewhere to start, these are some resources which I think you should explore and kind of familiarize yourself with if you haven't already. Apologies if everybody knows these already, but they're really worth pointing out. But the first, I actually could have changed the order of this because I think the first thing that you could do is really review what you've got in your own archive first. Depending on what you have collected yourselves, maybe what you've inherited from other volunteers or staff members, it might be that you've got really good, interesting quality material, whether it's oral histories, kind of old recordings of music, whatever it is, or singing. You've got stuff in your collection already, which people might, if you haven't had Gaelic expertise in your organisation, people might have looked at and said, oh, that's Gaelic stuff, I'm not going to look at that. And actually, you might really have a lot of things which are of great value and great interest and worthy of being kind of reconsidered. If you still lack the Gaelic expertise in your organisation, you have material that you don't know what to do with, there's an opportunity there to kind of scout for interest in your local community, people who maybe do have some interest or knowledge, or work with other museums or organisations in a similar position, have a bit of like community effort to try and kind of engage with the material and hear what you've got. If you don't have anything, if you're starting from nothing, first port of call is Topran Dúlchais. Historiches, this logo at the top here. This is a digital repository of archive material from, I think, 3 sources, primarily the School of Scottish Studies in Edinburgh, Edinburgh Uni, and also BBC archives as well. If there is a third, I can't remember where it's from right now. But this is an absolute treasure trove of material. There's a lot of stuff which is exclusively in Gaelic, but there's, for almost everything, there is a summary in English as well, so you can get an idea of what the topic is. And you can search by area or location, township, by individual as well. A big part of the museums that I'm working with at the moment is that so often it's kind of individual personalities that people are quite interested in, individual stories of people. Open Dúlchais can be a way of often finding people, and actually for a lot of people hearing them for the first time if you don't even realize that they're there. So it's a really, really valuable resource, and I strongly recommend having a wee book in it, having a wee rummage in it. But there's also like Gaelic is really closely connected still to any sort of kind of creative expression, and that includes contemporary and traditional arts. So 2 organisations who work across the Highlands, and I cannot really speak highly of enough, are Féisceann an Gael, so that's their name there, and Féis Roche. Now, I would hope that most of you will be familiar with their names, even if you're not familiar with their work. They do really, really fantastic work, not just as youth tutoring festivals, which is how they both originated, but working with artists and with musicians and with community groups to provide opportunities for lots of people, but all of it being rooted in Gaelic language and culture. They operate, Féis Roche operates the Cayley Trail, which happens right across the Highlands, and then Féisceann an Gael with the Highland Council do the festival Blas across every September, where it's top quality programming of Gaelic acts and artists. I would really encourage you to engage and kind of read about the work that they're doing, see the resources that they've got online, which includes some language learning resources as well as anything else, to kind of get a feel for how the language and the culture expresses itself through music and through kind of, well, oral histories from Topran and Dúlchais as well. There's so many different ways that we can use sound in all its guises within museums, which I think are often kind of underexploited, really. And in the Highlands, we've got these organisations doing really, really fantastic work, who I think which could be made a lot more of in the world of museums and heritage. But before I move on to the next slide, I mentioned earlier on to use the sprach, that accent that you're seeing here on the E in Fage. This is the word that I want to demonstrate as why it's so important to use it. Here, F-E fata, as we call it, so the long E, I-S means a festival, or has become synonymous with tutoring festivals that the Phasian are. If you just have that F-E-I-S without the accent, it means sexual intercourse. So the difference there is really, really important, and all the more reason why, if you see an accent on it, please use it, because you may think that it's immaterial, but actually you're saying something very, very different. So please use the accent if you can. Usually it's a fairly benign difference, but sometimes it really makes a difference. So a big part of what we do in museums as well as displays is kind of engaging with people in different ways. So through activities within the museum or take-home activities, outreach, engagement, learning. Anything that you have produced in English can be produced in Gaelic. It's kind of as straightforward as that. These are instances in which, for example, here with Museums of the Highlands, they have Gaelic language resources which have been professionally translated from the English. This is one instance in which translation can be totally fine, and a very sensible way of going about ensuring that you have quality resources which are at the sort of the right level. But you can also produce things from a Gaelic language perspective, which is offers something different and something alternative. It's something which I'm working with my colleagues from the Highland Museum of Childhood at the moment to work with Gaelic medium and Gaelic learner teachers from around the surrounding area, so primarily Dingwall and Inverness, to identify what their needs are for their pupils and for the classes that they teach. And that's going right through from frolicking, so preschool, nursery, right through to S6. So a huge age range. But the one thing that I do know from having met family members and friends who work in education is that there's never enough resources in Gaelic for people. So there's a huge gap there that can easily be filled by making the most of what we share as engagement and resources and activities and loan boxes that they can be delivered in Gaelic as well. So for instance, in a loan box, you've got all your objects in the box, but then if you've got a pasca and a folder with information about what's in the box and that sort of supporting material, that can be easily produced in Gaelic. And therefore you're giving an opportunity for kids who are learning Gaelic or being educated through the medium of Gaelic, an opportunity to engage with the materials from your museum in their own language. But there's another side to this as well, away from the kind of the formal learning, and that's engaging with some organisations, only two of which I've got listed here, but really there's a lot. But Common Gaelic, who are a youth development organisation working across the region, they've got a lot of Gaelic development officers. You'll probably find that there will be people covering your area who are looking for opportunities to engage young people with extracurricular Gaelic language activities. They might not ever have engaged with your museum. They might not know your museum at all. You can open your organisation up to them and say, we'd love to work with you in some way. Those people working for Common Gaelic might not know anything about heritage, about museums, so you can help share with them. It can be like a really sort of nice reciprocal relationship there. Sport Gaelic, sport, just means sports. This is an organisation who, again, it's about extracurricular opportunities, but getting kids out into the outdoors and really doing some quite adventurous sort of sporting activities. But when the outdoors, hill walking, climbing, whatever it is such a big part of kind of contemporary Highland life and culture. Here's an organisation who is doing it and able to share in their culture through doing that as well. So depending on what your interests are as a museum or heritage group, there's lots of opportunities here to kind of engage with Gaelic through this side of stuff as well as just displays. And I think all of this side of things has got a really important role to play in kind of strengthening communities and things as well, by demonstrating what what opportunities there are for the people on our doorstep, not just for summer visitors, but really for strengthening opportunities for young people as well. And another screenshot from the Museums of the Highlands, just showing look what can be done. You know, it's nice, playful design, and all in Gaelic, which is lovely. So, where are we? Here we are. This slide, to be honest, I could spend about 3 days just talking about this alone, and I'm almost not, I'm not wanting to go into it too deep because I run the risk of getting just totally carried away, and I've already been talking for over half an hour. But just to give an example of kind of some opportunities, if you're into folklore storytelling, intangible cultural heritage, or living traditions, Gaelic is very well placed to kind of help you indulge those interests, basically. A few of the objects here are from the West Highland Museum, collected by Alexander Carmichael, part of their Carmichael collection, which are really deeply entwined with folklore and traditional customs. Carmichael himself has been kind of people have examined his work over many sort of generations of academics and kind of questioned bits of it, analysed different bits of it, and concluded different things. But what his work represents, and especially in these actual objects from West Highland Museum, is kind of representation of many aspects of Gaelic culture which simply don't exist anymore, and much of it relating to these intangible things, traditional customs, folklore. There's a lot, there's so much that you can get into from this topic. But it also relates to kind of slightly more contemporary things. Like, I'm a big believer that, you know, when you're in the Highlands, Highland culture is its own very particular thing, and an awful lot of that is really rooted in Gaelic culture, and it's just quite often that it's kind of not really recognised as such. So with my colleagues at the Highland Museum of Childhood, we're kind of interrogating this a wee bit and thinking about what it might mean, and how Gaelic has, in a kind of maybe invisibly sometimes, influenced childhood and kind of a Highland upbringing, particularly in places where it's no longer a community language. And I think it's a really, really interesting topic, and one which has got a lot of mileage in it to kind of review and reflect and think, well, why is the case and what does this actually mean? And hopefully, I would think, help people re-engage with their own understanding and appreciation of Gaelic and how that has kind of influenced their lives, maybe without them realizing it. Calendar custom. So again, this is like a whole lecture in and of itself. But being that we're in November at the moment and around kind of Halloween and everything, it's particularly pertinent because there's a tremendous amount of misinformation around there about kind of Gaelic traditions around calendar dates. But it is actually a really, really important part of the culture. Things like Antavin, so the month that we're in just now, November, you'll have maybe seen that word around Samhain, and kind of different notions and ideas of it being a festival for this, that, and the next thing. A lot of it is very, very inaccurate and not really kind of rooted in anything that we might recognise as Gaelic culture. But there are some really deep roots there that are relevant. We've also, earlier in the year, probably my favourite time of the year, not just because it's close to my birthday, but La Buia Bealtaine, so May Day, which is one of the most significant dates on the Gaelic calendar. And many of you will be familiar with the idea of going out and washing your face in the morning dew on May Day for eternal youth and so on. But yeah, La Buia Bealtaine is a really significant sort of date. There's a lot that's with that as a particular example, there's a lot that's in there that's also relating to kind of the natural environment around us, because if there's like a Lúdsbealtaine and there's a particular plant that's associated with that time of year that would appear, it's something yellow, La Buia Bealtaine, of course. But there's a tremendous amount in this at particular times of year as a way that people kind of traditionally would have maybe, you know, marked the passing of whatever seasons or whatever events. If you decide to go down and explore this for your own museum or heritage organisation, you're in for a treat for the first part, but also tread carefully. Beware of misinformation and yeah, beware the sources that you're relying on when you're doing this, just in case things are kind of misrepresented. But there is a tremendous amount of mileage in this as a topic. I also hear this project, Guan na Tíre, meaning Voices of the Land, from Skye. I would recommend having a wee nosy around their website. They do really interesting work, kind of with a crossover between heritage, contemporary culture, and a lot of things to do with folklore and storytelling, and kind of a lot of intangible stuff as well. I think it was just on very recently, actually. So I would really recommend having a look there at how some Gaelic speakers and Gaelic speaking communities are kind of engaging with these sorts of topics, and within a wider sort of heritage and cultural heritage setting. So another one, quite straightforward. Now we're getting into a topic where I think there's perennial interest, and it's a very easy way of engaging with Gaelic language as well, because it is everywhere around us in the landscape. It's in place names, it's in hill names, it's in topography. These are names which they're often descriptive, descriptive perhaps of the appearance of a landmass or a feature in the landscape, but also of the experience of being in that part of the landscape. These names also, really importantly, say something about the many, many lives that have been lived in these areas of the Highlands. And I think that Gaelic has got a really important role to play in countering the narrative, which I certainly am scunnered of seeing and hearing, about Highlands and Islands, that it is remote, it's wild, it's empty, as opposed to actually there being evidence for life in just about every corner of it, and it being a deep, deep old landscape, not an empty landscape. So what I call Gaelic cultural practices, but cultural practices have informed the landscape, be that kind of crofting development of township, different forms of agriculture, particularly pre-crofting agriculture, and also in coastal life, which I'm not really diving into too much here. But examples of that might be, and I think this picture here in the bottom left comes from, I think comes from across. This one in the middle here, this is from a township called Chiredigan in the Ross of Mull, pretty far off the beaten track. But here where when it was cleared / abandoned, I think there was a little bit of both going on. It was in the stages that it was within the crofting system at that point, but there's a lot of evidence for pre-crofting life in this bit. And what's really interesting is that it's now viewed as being kind of like rough, boggy, sort of impenetrable land, whereas actually it's overcome with bracken because the land had been worked on, but had been so productive and so rich by the time that people were no longer there, that bracken has now overtaken it. So I think it's really interesting to kind of view our landscape as a way of kind of that really the kind of scourge of bracken really being evidence of where people once were in many ways. And over here on the right hand side, I'm not looking too much at coastal stuff, but here is evidence of a carry, a fish trap. This is also from Mull, but I'm a total bias towards Mull, I'm afraid, because I spent a lot of time there. A fish trap where it's in an area where a lot of people will put around the coastline, but it's not really used as a kind of spot for fishing or anything anymore. This fish trap is still quite a few courses high in the stonework, but nowhere near as big as it would have been. And I think it's really interesting to think about the different sort of evidence for uses and exploitation of the landscape. And again, getting back to the idea that it isn't, empty or wild or anything like it. I'm just going to flag here a new project just not long since started in Applecross called Cullia Horigarav. This is a community woodland funded by the Heritage Lottery, where I'm involved with my colleagues from Applecross Historical Centre, Historical Society and Heritage Centre, to develop a community woodland post clear felling, where there's going to be a lot of kind of Gaelic centred, Gaelic focused, Gaelic led really interpretation, and building in kind of perspectives of what life might have been like for the people who were living there from decades to centuries ago. So it's building in these sorts of slightly different ideas. And here, I took these examples from a publication called Gaelic Ecosystem Services, which a man called Roddy McLean wrote. Some of you might know Roddy already. His work is always worth reading. Just to give an example of where place names can not just be descriptive, but actually say something about, you know, the living landscape as well, the kind of productive landscape and how it was used. So we're back to Mull for this example, I'm afraid. This is up near Dervig. This here, Toad do, Todhar, and this in its kind of contemporary aerial mapping on the right-hand side. Thank you to NLS for use of the maps, of course. NLS website, always one of the best resources that we've got out there just now. What's interesting here is that Toad, quoting Roddy's work here, is that it's a field manured by penning cattle in it. But Tor can also represent a bleaching place or a place where seaweed is collected. Now, this is fairly far upland from the coast, so I doubt that it would be seaweed, but it's interesting to think of the different ways in which that this little area might have been used. And then moving over to Wester Ross, where I think we've got some folk from today. We're just south of Anchelloch here, if anybody knows this particular bit of area particularly well. And if you see here, we're just missing the S at the end of it, but Stra na Shellac, and then Avin Stra na Shellac here. So Strath, and this being the Strath of the hunting, and then Loch na Shellac as well. This is a misspelling, as you quite often see in old maps. But what I think what's interesting here is that you're getting a sense, and you can see it really nicely in this aerial photography of that strath and that really sort of rich green land, and then kind of low-lying in here as well. You get a sense of how people would have been moving and using the landscape by seeing it by hunting, and more often than not, it would be red deer that people would be hunting here. So it's ways in which it isn't just, like I say, it's not just descriptive of how it looks, it's really saying something about how people were living in the landscape as well and kind of using it. And this phrase down here is very well known in Gaelic. Slaat a talle bratan a líne fiig a firoch tri miarlin asnach de gav gael rief nare. So the idea being that you take what you need and then there should hopefully be plenty for everybody else as well. So a well-known expression. Now the third example I want to show here is Kyle Ray Otter. I actually had an example from Dornoch, but I don't have an image of it. I'll maybe come back to it later, sorry. Is Kyle Ray Otterhide. So over in Skye, again, some of you might have been here before. Like many hides, is unmanned and it's operated by Forestry and Land Scotland now, although when the signage was put up, it was still Forestry Commission. Now, if you think about these kind of design and style wise, the signs are perhaps like a wee bit, you know, dated and out of fashion. But the actual content here is really interesting, and I think the approach to using Gaelic is really informative and a very thoughtful way of using it in a way which I think we could see a lot more of as well. So here we've got a kind of a general introduction talking about how place names really are, you know, informative and help us kind of decode the landscape around us. But what's different here is that in the Gaelic, it's speaking to Gaelic speakers. The overall messaging is broadly the same, but it isn't kind of, it's written by a Gaelic speaker for a Gaelic speaker. And that's what's really different. It's a very different experience reading that as a Gael rather than it just being a translation of what's here in the English. A lot more value to it. Oh, wrong way, sorry. Now, and again, terrible photos, I'm sorry. Like I say, old phone and bad light in this case as well. But these are some kind of close-ups of some of the panels that are inside it. And here, the Gaelic is there. It's there. We've got the differentiation in colour and some metallics being used there as well to kind of show where there's the difference. I think maybe a wee bit too much going on here, but it's also showing kind of some concepts in Gaelic really, and about how they're demonstrated through the language too. So, and I think I quite like this. I think it's a really nice way of doing it, that it's not just that it's telling you what the word is, it's actually explaining something about it. It's giving kind of a wee bit more value. And although this has got quite a lot of detail in it, and not everybody will remember all of this, I think given where it's situated, and I think if you're going to an otter hide in Skye, chances are that you have some sort of interest or investment in the natural world around you. So I think in this setting, it's appropriate to kind of have this sort of level of depth. So you can see these different words which are used here, and they're just given the kind of English language equivalent. And you'll see words here which might be familiar from other hill names like Garav, which means rough, but here it's really showing the kind of the wider sense of what that word means in Gaelic, the boisterous wave or a breaker, rather than it just being a rough wave, which doesn't actually convey very much in English at all. And this is the last slide from MacQuarrie that I've got, and it's very dark in the top corner here, but again, what's interesting is that they've given hill names, so these are likely what you'll see on like an OS map, Bein na Gréine, Cnoch Gavadurui, Elanlia and Coolrea, and a translation of them at the bottom. But I think what's most interesting is this little section in the middle of each of them, where it's actually explaining to you what these different words mean. Now, it's not getting into the nitty-gritty of why this is Gréine rather than Grian, because of, grammatical changes and so on, but it's giving people an opportunity to see what these words are. And I would like to think then recognize them elsewhere when they're out and about, even if the people aren't remembering exactly what they say, kind of think, oh yeah, I have seen that before, I kind of remember that from somewhere else. I think it's a really, really nice way of doing it. And I think this is really achievable as well. I think there are a lot of resources out there about place names and place name study, and it is a huge sort of field of work in and of itself. But there's enough solid, reliable, quality information that I think a lot of places could be kind of showing meaning and understanding in this way without worrying about kind of misinformation and stuff, and kind of sharing that with people, particularly when we know that so many people are drawn to our landscapes because of the hills and wanting to get out in them. I will say that although each one here has included a phonetic pronunciation, I think among the kind of Gaelic speakers I know who operate in this world of work, kind of fallen a bit out of fashion, mostly because it's so subjective that it's very, very hard to kind of get anything where you're really going to be certain of the pronunciation. There's a lot of room for error. And also it's assuming a certain kind of accent, a way of pronouncing things, which is maybe not just not the best way to approach things. So for me, leave it out. I think there are different ways in which you can kind of help people understand the pronunciation. But I can understand why it's included. People want to enable people to try pronouncing something rather than someone looking at it and kind of thinking, well, I don't even know where to start. So that's just a wee note on phonetics there. Basically, I think in an ideal world, we'd all be using the International Phonetic Alphabet, but nobody knows that. So it's fine for linguists. So now on to Draenolation from Skye. So this is a fairly recent installation of signage. Some of you might have seen it if you've been up in the north end of Skye. I've had to kind of shamelessly nick these images off social media because I didn't have any photos of my own. And I know that the photographer was listed as were the people who designed it. So credits there for their due, because I don't know in other circumstances where they are. And I think what's interesting here is that we've got a location where we know that there is a huge number of visitors, both from within the UK and Scotland and also international. And at some of like the real sort of hotspot sites, rather than just doing the easy thing, which would be just doing English language only as being the kind of universal language, they have kind of doggedly included Gaelic at every turn. And I think it's a really interesting approach to take. Ferang, Doveg and Dewey, and including here, so Gaelic phrases at the start, and then explaining what the name means of Draenolation and Ridgewages, but who they are, and then incorporating little bits of Gaelic throughout the English sentences as well. There is, down at the bottom here, I realise it's a bit blurry, it's an English paragraph at first and then Gaelic at the bottom. But I think what's really interesting is that it's ensuring that any visitors coming to this site, and maybe some of you work in places where you're in a similar position with kind of real hotspot sites locally, it's ensuring that any visitor comes there knows that they've got their own language, got their own culture, and it's something that people should be more aware of, and it's ensuring that at this kind of first opportunity that people are seeing it. So I think that's a really nice example of doing that. Obviously, the the production values and everything of these are significant when you've got some really substantial signage which is going outside. But again, it's the wider principle about kind of how they've gone about incorporating Gaelic, which I think is really interesting here. And again, absolutely achievable for just about everybody. So that's a good fact. I'm not going to get into that, but it's true. But we're getting into the last bit now, and where it kind of starts to get a bit tricky, I think, because we're talking about advocacy. I know that many of you here, you'll either be working or volunteering for a museum which has a board. Maybe you are a board member yourself for one organisation or another. And I know that going back to the idea of misconceptions around Gaelic, there is often a distinct lack of support for Gaelic at board level, no matter what size your organisation is. It's kind of just like a sad fact. I would suggest that there is at every turn, if we're talking about representing heritage in the Highlands to our communities, to any visitors, we have a moral obligation to use Gaelic, I think. Just end off. The language is indigenous to the place. We should be using it, full stop. But I appreciate that to some people can seem a bit hard line, and it doesn't always wash with people. So how do we go about addressing that? But it can be difficult, but it is fundamentally, it's slightly trite to say so, but it is about winning hearts and minds. It is about kind of convincing people about where the value and where the opportunities lie for using Gaelic. It's not a box ticking exercise. It shouldn't be an obligation, which is seen as which is seen as something to weigh people down. It's an opportunity to view the world in a different way, to give Gaels the chance to engage with their heritage through their own language, for people to re-engage with it if they have lost that connection to their language and to their heritage. Excuse me. And also allowing visitors to experience Gaelic language, culture and heritage with integrity and respect. I think that's a really important point. If you think back to that panel that I showed you from the public sector museum, where it was kind of had no respect for the language whatsoever, we've got an opportunity to kind of correct past wrongs and really demonstrate to people, especially if you're using Gaelic for the first time, that we want to do this. We want to kind of give it a shot. With it being a different culture, as I've said a few times, it gives you a different way of looking at the world when you start to really engage with it. There's a lot of creative potential. There's a huge amount of opportunities of working with artists and creative practitioners of all stripes. A lot of opportunities for young people to get involved and think about their history, their past, their community, and how ensure that they see themselves in your organisation or in your institution. And I think if you, a point which I haven't got written here, but I should have done, I think a good way of, which I've seen some success with before, is that if you know that there is an interest from your visitors, your volunteers, your stakeholders, if there's a lot of people who want to be doing something with Gaelic, or want, and maybe want to see it more in your museum, get some testimonies from them, get comments in your visitor book, find ways of kind of having a body of evidence for your board members or your powers that be, whoever that is, to demonstrate that there is actually an active need. It isn't just kind of one person's interest, although I always think that should be enough, but it often isn't. Have a body of evidence where you can kind of say to people, there's a need for this, there's a demand for it, and a demand that you can answer. But fundamentally, I think sometimes it's just really hard. I mean, goodness knows, I work in Gaelic development across both my jobs, and some days you just feel like you're banging your head off the wall, which is a sad fact. So my approach is take the wins where you find them. Sometimes that's all that you can do, and squeeze in Gaelic at every opportunity. Sometimes you have to do it by stealth. Sometimes you have to be kind of a bit sneaky about it. But there are always opportunities to use Gaelic in some way or some capacity. And it's just celebrating the wins where you find them. And if you're constantly hitting against a brick wall, just take a step back and kind of reconsider your approach or what ways that you can do it. Some people simply will never ever be won over, and I think that's a sad fact. If you wanted to get heavy about it, you could say that there are language rights and perhaps a legal obligation. These are really kind of more at state level than they are at the sort of level that we work at maybe, but it can be a sort of, I don't know, a way of kind of demonstrating to people that it isn't just that you quite fancy Gaelic and you want to do something with it, that actually you're kind of responding to some legalities really. So there's the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. I should have had that written there, which is maybe one of the which is a really interesting thing to look at and see kind of the way that that represents linguistic communities as well as communities who are ethnic or cultural minorities. It's a really, really interesting sort of wee road to go down, and sometimes that can help, other times it doesn't at all. The other thing that I will flag here is the anticipated forthcoming Scottish Languages Bill. I can't remember what the actual proper name for it. I think that might just be it. Actually, maybe somebody can keep me right. In which it is anticipated, but not confirmed yet, that there will be more rights given as an act of parliament to Scots for one and Gaelic for another. There's nothing set in stone about this, but it's something which, if you have a board who are into that side of things, you can say, well, actually, maybe we want to prepare for this by what it might mean if there's any sort of like trickle down effect that might impact the work that you do, that you can be ready to respond to it. So as far as kind of board stuff is concerned, it can be really tricky. But if we think back to the do's and don'ts which I mentioned at the start, and about normalizing it, not letting misconceptions go unchallenged, these little things, step by step, can all have a much bigger, wider positive impact, and which can help kind of chip away at any sort of either active anti-Gaelic sentiment, or maybe get people who don't think that they're interested, maybe give them an opportunity to find a route into it, which is of interest to them. So, Janish, what next? Fundamentally, I'd say clack in your Kylie, use it or lose it. As an expression that we hear just about every day in Gaelic, because it's true. Exercise that muscle with any Gaelic that you've got or that you're starting to acquire. If we don't use it, we lose it. It is as simple as that. But also inform yourselves. Read, learn, listen, experience. Visit these places that I've mentioned, and there's so many more. And when you go to other sites across the country, and including out with the Highlands, ask yourself, if you're not seeing Gaelic there, ask yourself why. Where is it? And if you are seeing it, well, how are they using Gaelic in this way? How are they representing it? How are they considering Gaelic? Connect with people in your local and your wider area. There are a lot of people out there who have got interests and skills and knowledge who are ready and willing to share it. And then most importantly, please, Misneach is a great word in Gaelic. It's a concept which doesn't really have a direct translation into English, but it means to have confidence and courage and self-belief in what you're doing. So if you're starting to explore ways of using Gaelic and kind of finding routes into it, just even if you're kind of hitting a brick wall or finding it difficult or challenging, just remember why you're doing it and who you're doing it for. You'll be helping to kind of represent a minoritized culture, which is a good thing fundamentally. And here are some useful resources, which are things which I think are great. And maybe Nicola, if people are interested, I could share this around the email maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot more than this. And if you want to go into like the real kind of history of the language and language development, there's a whole massive body of work and body of research, which is really interesting, but not for everybody. But there's a mini course by Open University. It's totally free, called Gaelic and Modern Scotland, which is really interesting. Some of the facts and figures in it are now in need of being updated, but the actual substantive sort of information in it is really, really good and can provide a really broad and yet very informed overview for what it means, what it means to have Gaelic in Scotland today. James Fraser's book, James Hunter. Who's James Fraser? I don't know. On the Other Side of Sorrow is a brilliant read. I really recommend that. It looks into the kind of representation through poetry of kind of what it means to be a Gael, really. Big concepts, but it's, as you would expect with James Winters, is brilliantly written and really, really well researched and well considered. For material culture, Hugh Cheap's body of work is excellent. He's now at Solomon Rostock. He was formerly a keeper at, I should say, Professor Hugh Cheap. He was a keeper at the National Museum and is an authority on kind of Gaelic material culture. Anne Martin from Skye, she is an artist and a singer who's who draws upon heritage for a lot of her work. So if she's actually involved with that Guan Nichira project that I mentioned a few slides back, her body of work is really interesting for that kind of intersection between contemporary, historic, tangible and intangible. Learn Gaelic to Net for everybody who wants to start learning the language formally, please do. And Roddy McLean, who I mentioned, Ruairi MacLean, he is a frequent writer for Nature Scott, and he there is, I think you can actually click through from that. There is on the Nature Scott blog on their website, he writes really, really brilliantly researched pieces about Gaelic language, Gaelic culture, but Gaelic from an environmental and nature perspective. So I really recommend diving into all of those. But also, if you want to know more about the actual kind of a history of the language, going back to its earliest days, and its kind of development over the years, there's a tremendous amount of work out there. And I think we've probably got some people in the audience who might be able to share their own work on that topic as well. So that's it from me. I can talk for an hour, that's long enough. Thank you to Nicola and the team from MHH for asking me along today. I'm happy to take questions and answer things. That's my work email address there. And otherwise, maybe it's time to see if there's any questions.
Great, thank you, Anna. Fashion uversochinchnoch agus kuchikal. That was really interesting and helpful. Thank you, Anna. And yeah, it'd be good to hear if anybody's got any questions for Anna just now. I'll just stop the recording. And then if people are happy to put their